9:17 in the afternoon on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, while American soldiers at Camp Perry, Ohio, celebrated with champagne and fireworks, 23-year-old Unteroffizier Matthias Keller stood behind the barbed wire fence and told his bunkmate something that made absolutely no sense. "Emil, I'm not going back to Germany." Sergeant James Morrison overheard this. He was standing 30 feet away, organizing repatriation paperwork, and he stopped what he was doing. He looked at Matthias. He laughed. "Keller, you don't mean that. Wait till you see home. You'll change your mind." Matthias looked him in the eye. "I've seen what's left of home, Sergeant. There is no home." Morrison thought Matthias was joking. He was not joking. What Morrison didn't know, what none of the American administrators at Camp Perry understood yet, was that within 6 months, hundreds of German prisoners of war across Ohio would actively resist repatriation. Some would attempt to hide. Others would return to Germany, only to find ways to immigrate back to America. And a few would never leave at all. Matthias Keller had arrived at Camp Perry on March 17, 1943. He was 21 years old. He had been captured during the final days of the Tunisia campaign, processed through a temporary camp in Algeria, shipped to Norfolk, Virginia, then transferred by train to northern Ohio. The journey took 34 days. When he stepped off that train at Port Clinton, Matthias expected something resembling the prisoner camps he had heard about from soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front. Barbed wire, guard towers, brutal conditions, minimal food. The kind of place where men disappeared. What he found was different. Camp Perry occupied 640 acres on the shore of Lake Erie. The main compound held 3,200 prisoners in wooden barracks that had heating and electricity, actual electricity. Matthias had not lived in a building with reliable electricity since leaving Dresden 2 years earlier. The camp had a library, a canteen where prisoners could buy Coca-Cola and cigarettes with the money they earned from work details, recreational facilities, a theater. The barracks had real beds with mattresses, not straw pallets. The windows had glass. Matthias stood in the processing area that first day, March 17th, 1943, and tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been told for the past 10 years. The Reich had been very clear about what happened to German soldiers captured by the Americans: torture, starvation, summary execution. The propaganda films had shown this. The officers had repeated this. Every soldier knew this. But the processing officer, a lieutenant whose name Matthias never learned, was explaining the camp rules in a tone that suggested he was bored, not threatening. The rules were posted on the wall in German. Clean German, properly translated, not the mangled translations Matthias had seen in propaganda materials. The lieutenant finished his explanation and looked at Matthias. "Any questions?" Matthias had many questions. He asked none of them. He shook his head. "Good. You'll be assigned to Barracks 7. Dinner is at 6 p.m. Don't be late." Matthias was not late. At 5:45 p.m. on March 17, 1943, he walked into the mess hall at Camp Perry and experienced the first of many fundamental contradictions that would define the next 2 years of his life. The mess hall was clean, not military clean where cleanliness is enforced through punishment and fear. Actually clean. The floor had been mopped recently. The tables had been wiped down. The smell was not the smell of institutional kitchens Matthias knew from the Wehrmacht, burnt grease and desperation, and too many men in too small a space. This smelled like food. Actual food being cooked by people who knew what they were doing. Matthias got in line. A German prisoner in front of him, someone who had clearly been at the camp longer, was talking to another prisoner about the evening's menu. Talking about the menu, as if there were choices, as if this were a restaurant. Matthias reached the front of the line. An American soldier, a private who looked about 19 years old, handed him a tray. On that tray was more food than Matthias had seen on a single plate since 1941. Scrambled eggs, 3 eggs scrambled with milk and butter still steaming, bacon, 4 strips of bacon cooked crisp, toast, 2 slices of white bread toasted with butter, actual butter, not margarine, a small cup of orange juice, Real orange juice, not the reconstituted powder the Wehrmacht sometimes provided. And coffee. A full mug of coffee that smelled like actual coffee, not the chicory blend he had been drinking in North Africa. Matthias stood there holding the tray. He did not move. The private looked at him. "You okay, buddy?" Matthias nodded. He walked to a table. He sat down. He looked at the food. He picked up the fork. He ate one bite of the eggs. They were good. They were very good. They tasted like eggs were supposed to taste, with salt and pepper and butter. They were hot. They were fresh. Matthias ate everything on the tray. He ate until he felt physically sick. He had not consumed that much food in a single meal in 2 years. His stomach, which had adapted to Wehrmacht rations, and then to even less during the final months in Tunisia, could not process this quantity. He made it outside before he vomited. His bunkmate found him 20 minutes later, sitting against the wall of Barracks 7, breathing slowly, trying to calm his stomach. "First day?" Matthias looked up. The man was older, maybe 26, with the accent of someone from Hamburg. He had kind eyes. "Yes." "I'm Emil. Emil Schneider. You'll get used to the food. Took me a week." "How long have you been here?" 5 months. Captured in Tunisia, same as you probably. They feed us like this every day." Matthias processed this information. Every day. Every day. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Geneva Convention requires it. The Americans feed us the same rations they give their own soldiers. 4,000 calories per day. Matthias did the math in his head. 4,000 calories. The Wehrmacht provided German soldiers with approximately 2,800 calories per day, and that was in theory. In practice, especially in North Africa toward the end, it was much less. German civilians back home were receiving about 1,800 calories per day, if they were lucky. "They're fattening us up," Matthias said. "For something." Emil sat down next to him. "That's what I thought too. For the first month I thought they were fattening us for slaughter, like pigs. Feed us well, then kill us. But it's been 5 months. I've gained 23 pounds, so have most of the others. Nobody has been slaughtered." "Then why?" "Because," Emil said, "the Geneva Convention requires it." "And the Americans actually follow the Geneva Convention. I know that sounds insane, but it appears to be true." Matthias did not believe this. He could not believe this. Nothing in his experience of the past 2 years supported this interpretation of reality. But he also could not explain the food he had just eaten and then vomited. On March 18, 1943, his second day at Camp Perry, Matthias was weighed by the camp doctor as part of the standard medical examination required for all new prisoners. He weighed 56 kilograms, 123 pounds. The doctor, an American captain who spoke some German, made a note in his file. "You're malnourished. Underweight for your height by about 15 kilograms. We'll fix that." Matthias said nothing. "Do you have any medical conditions I should know about?" "No, sir." "Any injuries from combat?" "No, sir." "Any diseases, dysentery, malaria?" Matthias had experienced dysentery in Tunisia. He mentioned this. The doctor made another note. "It's resolved." "Yes, sir." "Good. We'll monitor you. Eat 3 meals a day. All of them. Your body needs to recover." The doctor was not wrong. Over the next 8 months, Matthias would eat 3 meals a day every day without exception. Breakfast at 6:30 a.m., lunch at noon, dinner at 6 p.m. Every meal included meat, vegetables, bread, fruit, or juice, and a hot beverage. On Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 1943. The prisoners at Camp Perry were served turkey with all traditional accompaniments: stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, dinner rolls, pumpkin pie for dessert. Matthias ate this meal sitting next to Emil, who had by this point gained 26 kilograms and looked like a different person than the gaunt figure who had introduced himself 8 months earlier. They did not talk much during the meal. They were both too busy eating. Afterward, walking back to the barracks in the November cold, Emil said something Matthias would remember for the rest of his life. "I think they actually mean it." "Mean what?" "The Geneva Convention. The humane treatment. All of it. I think they actually believe in it. On December the 25th, 1943, Christmas Day, the prisoners were served ham sweet potatoes, more cranberry sauce, and 2 kinds of pie, apple, and mincemeat. The mess hall was decorated with paper chains that some of the prisoners had made during recreation time. There was a small Christmas tree in the corner. Someone had placed a star on top made from tinfoil. The American guards sang Christmas carols. Some of the German prisoners sang along harmonizing. Silent Night sounded the same in German and English, just different words over the same melody. Matthias did not sing. He sat at his table eating ham that had been baked with brown sugar and cloves and tried to understand what was happening. By November 1943, 8 months after arriving at Camp Perry, Matthias weighed 75 kilograms, 165 pounds. He had gained 19 kilograms, 42 pounds. Emil had gone from 59 kilograms to 85 kilograms, a gain of 26 kilograms, 57 pounds. Other prisoners experienced similar transformations. Men who had arrived gaunt and malnourished from North Africa became healthy. The camp doctor conducted regular medical examinations and documented this in his reports. Prisoner health improved dramatically during captivity. This was not normal. This was not what anyone expected, but the food was only part of it. The prisoners worked. The Geneva Convention permitted this as long as the work was not directly related to military operations. Camp Perry assigned prisoners to agricultural labor, mainly on farms surrounding the camp in northern Ohio. Matthias was assigned to a tomato farm 8 miles west of Port Clinton. The farm was owned by a man named Howard Patterson. On April 12, 1943, 4 weeks after arriving at Camp Perry, Matthias climbed into the back of a truck with 23 other German prisoners at 6:30 in the morning. An American guard, a corporal whose name was Davies, rode in the front. The truck drove west through flat Ohio farmland that reminded Matthias of the countryside outside Dresden. The farm appeared after 20 minutes. 160 acres of relatively flat land with a white farmhouse, a red barn, several outbuildings and endless rows of tomato plants in various stages of growth. The truck pulled up to the barn. The prisoners climbed out. A man was waiting for them. Howard Patterson was 54 years old. He was 6 feet tall, weathered from decades of outdoor work with grey hair and hands that looked like they had handled every kind of farm equipment ever invented. He was wearing work clothes, denim overalls, a flannel shirt, boots caked with dried mud. He looked at the 24 German prisoners standing in front of his barn and said nothing for a long time. Corporal Davies made introductions. "Mr. Patterson, these are your workers. They'll be here 7 to 5 Monday through Saturday. 1 hour lunch break at noon. The army pays you 80 cents per day per man. Any questions?" Patterson looked at the prisoners. His face showed nothing. "No questions." Davies turned to the prisoners. "You follow Mr. Patterson's instructions. You work hard. You don't cause trouble. Understood?" 24 men said yes in German accented English. Davies got back in the truck and drove away. Patterson stood there for another long moment, looking at these 24 enemy soldiers who were now his workforce. Then he pointed at the tomato fields. "Rows need weeding. Start there. I'll show you what to pull and what to leave." For the first 3 weeks, Howard Patterson did not speak to Matthias beyond basic work instructions. Pull these weeds, load these crates, move these irrigation pipes. The instructions were clear and professional. Patterson demonstrated what needed to be done, watched to make sure it was understood, then moved on to supervise other workers. Matthias understood this. Patterson's sons were fighting in the Pacific. One of them, Nathaniel, was 25 years old and had been wounded at Guadalcanal 6 months earlier. The other, Samuel, was 22 and healthy, and somewhere in the Pacific Theater, though Patterson did not know exactly where because military censorship prevented soldiers from revealing their locations in letters home. These were Patterson's sons. These were his boys. And now he was employing German prisoners of war men who until very recently had been fighting for the same cause as the Japanese soldiers who had wounded Nathaniel and were trying to kill Samuel. Matthias understood why Patterson did not speak to him. But Matthias also understood farming. He had grown up on a small farm outside Dresden. His father, Otto Keller, had grown potatoes and vegetables on 20 acres of rented land. Matthias had worked that farm from the time he was old enough to carry a basket until the day he left for Wehrmacht, training at age 18. He knew soil. He knew irrigation. He knew when plants needed water and when they needed to be left alone. On the morning of May the 3rd, 1943, the beginning of his 4th week at the Patterson farm, Matthias was working in the section of field closest to the main irrigation line when he noticed water pooling where it should not be pooling. He followed the water back to its source. One of the main irrigation pipes had developed a crack, probably from frost damage during the previous winter. Water was leaking out, flooding a section of field and depriving another section of water entirely. Matthias looked around. Patterson was on the other side of the property supervising a different group of prisoners. The break was not catastrophic, not yet, but it would become catastrophic if left unaddressed for even a few hours in the May heat. Matthias walked to the barn. He found the tools he needed: a pipe wrench, spare irrigation coupling, waterproof tape. He walked back to the break. He shut off the water supply to that section. He removed the damaged section of pipe. He installed the new coupling. He wrapped everything with waterproof tape. He turned the water back on. The leak stopped. He put the tools back in the barn. He returned to weeding. Patterson discovered what Matthias had done 2 hours later when he walked that section of the irrigation line during his afternoon inspection. He stood there looking at the repair for a long time. Then he walked over to where Matthias was working. "Did you fix that pipe?" Matthias stood up. He nodded. "Yes, sir." "Where'd you learn to do that?" "My father. He grew potatoes outside Dresden. We had irrigation problems every spring." Patterson looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time since Matthias had started working at the farm 4 weeks earlier. He was quiet for maybe 15 seconds. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a canteen, and handed it to Matthias. "Drink." Matthias drank. The water was cold and clean. "Thank you, sir." Patterson took the canteen back. He did not say anything else. He walked away. But something had changed. Matthias could feel it. Something fundamental had shifted in how Howard Patterson saw the German prisoner working in his tomato fields. Over the next few weeks, Patterson began speaking to Matthias during work breaks. Short exchanges, observations about weather, comments about soil conditions, questions about farming techniques. The conversations were brief and professional, but they were conversations. In June, Patterson asked about Matthias's family. "Your father still farming?" "I don't know, sir. Last letter I received was 6 months ago." "What did it say?" "That they were well, that Dresden was still standing despite air raids, that food was becoming difficult to obtain." Patterson nodded. He did not ask any more questions that day. But the next week, he asked about Matthias's experience in the Wehrmacht. Where had he served? What had he done? How had he been captured? Matthias answered honestly. He had served in the Africa Corps. Logistics, not combat infantry. He had been captured when his unit ran out of fuel and ammunition during the final collapse in Tunisia. He had surrendered to British forces who handed him over to Americans who put him on a ship. "You ever kill anyone?" "No, sir." "You would have, though, if you'd been in combat." "Yes, sir, I would have." Patterson thought about this. "My boys are killing Japanese soldiers right now, probably." Samuel writes that he's seen things he can't describe in letters. Things that'll stay with him forever. Matthias said nothing. There was nothing to say. "You're about the same age as Samuel?" "Yes, sir." 21? "Yes, sir." "Same age, different uniforms, different countries, same war." Patterson walked away. But he came back the next day, and the day after that, and the conversations continued. Life at Camp Perry developed a routine that became so familiar it stopped feeling like captivity and started feeling like something else. Something Matthias did not have a name for. Wake at 6 a.m., breakfast at 6:30, work from 7 to 5, 6 days a week, dinner at 6 p.m., recreation from 7 to 10, lights out at 10:30. The recreation hours were not empty time. The camp had organized activities nearly every night of the week. Monday was movie night. The camp showed Hollywood films, Newsreels, documentaries. The prisoners watched Casablanca, For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Wizard of Oz. Some of the younger prisoners had never seen American films before. They were fascinated by the technology, the production quality, the casual wealth displayed on screen. Even in films about poverty or struggle, the characters had more material possessions than most Germans had seen in years. Tuesday was sports night. The prisoners had formed soccer teams, volleyball teams, even a basketball league. The Americans provided equipment. The games were competitive. Men who had been enemies on the battlefield played against each other in organized athletic competition and followed the rules and shook hands afterward. Wednesday was educational programming. The camp brought in speakers, showed anti-Nazi films attempting to re-educate prisoners about the true nature of the regime they had served, offered English language classes taught by American volunteers from Port Clinton. Matthias attended the English classes. He wanted to understand the language of the country holding him captive. Thursday was open recreation, ping-pong, chess, cards, reading. The camp library had books in German obtained from universities and donated by German-American families. Matthias read everything he could find: novels, history, technical manuals about agriculture. Friday was concert night. Several prisoners were trained musicians. They had formed a small orchestra that performed classical music. The camp provided instruments: violin, cello, trumpet, clarinet. The concerts attracted not just prisoners, but American guards and administrative staff as spectators. Men who had been shooting at each other months earlier now sat in the same room listening to Beethoven. Saturday, the camp showed movies again. Sunday was rest day with optional religious services. Matthias attended the Catholic Mass every Sunday. The camp had a Catholic chaplain, an American priest from Cleveland who spoke some German. Father Michael O'Brien was 45 years old, second-generation Irish-American, and he delivered sermons that focused on forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of peace. The chapel was a converted storage building that held 60 people. Matthias found the services comforting. Everything else about his life had changed radically in 2 years. He had gone from being a farmer's son in Dresden to a Wehrmacht soldier in Africa to a prisoner of war in Ohio. Everything was different. Everything was strange. The Mass remained constant. The Latin prayers, the ritual, the sense that something existed beyond the immediate chaos of war and captivity and uncertainty. After services, prisoners were allowed to write letters. Mail was heavily censored by American authorities, but it was permitted. Matthias wrote to his mother Elsa Keller every Sunday without fail. He told her about the camp, about the food, about the work, about Howard Patterson and the tomato farm. He tried to make his life sound bearable because he did not want her to worry. He did not describe how strange it felt to be treated humanely by the enemy. He did not explain that he was gaining weight while she and his father and his younger sister Greta were probably losing weight as food became scarcer in Germany. His mother's responses came irregularly. Mail from Germany was unreliable, especially after 1944 when Allied bombing intensified. But when letters did arrive, Matthias read them dozens of times, memorizing every sentence. She wrote that Dresden was still standing despite air raids, that food was scarce but manageable through rationing and her small garden. That his father's health was declining. Otto was 58 now, his lungs damaged from years of farm work and cigarette smoking. That Greta, 16 years old, was helping with household tasks and doing well in school despite the disruptions. She wrote that she prayed for the war to end, that she prayed for Matthias to come home safely, that she missed him. The last letter Matthias received from his mother was dated November 3rd, 1944. It arrived at Camp Perry on January 12, 1945, 10 weeks after it was written. In that letter, Elsa described the increasingly frequent air raid sirens, the hours spent in basement shelters, the anxiety of not knowing when the next attack would come. But she also wrote that the family was together, that they were surviving, that Dresden remained relatively intact compared to other German cities, that they would endure. Matthias wrote back immediately, a long letter, 8 pages, telling his mother everything he could say within the limits of censorship. That he was healthy, that he was working, that the Americans treated prisoners according to international law, that he thought of home constantly, that he loved her and his father and Greta, that he would see them again when this war finally ended. His mother never received that letter. On February 13, 1945, Allied bombers attacked Dresden in a massive firebombing raid that killed approximately 25,000 people and destroyed 90% of the city centre. The attack came in waves. British bombers first dropping high-explosive bombs to blow out windows and doors and expose building interiors. Then American bombers dropping incendiary bombs that ignited fires. The fires merged into a firestorm with temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The firestorm created its own weather system, with winds strong enough to pull people into the flames. Matthias did not learn about this until March. A Red Cross notification arrived at Camp Perry. Brief, official, devastating. Elsa Keller, deceased. February 13, 1945. Dresden. Otto Keller, deceased. February 13, 1945. Dresden. Greta Keller, deceased. February 13, 1945. Dresden. Their apartment building had collapsed during the firestorm. The entire block had burned. There were no survivors. There were no bodies to bury. There was nothing left. Matthias received this notification on March 8, 1945. He was sitting in the barracks after dinner when a camp administrator, Lieutenant Morrison, approached him with the Red Cross telegram. Morrison handed it to him without saying anything. There was nothing to say. Matthias read the telegram. He read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He stood up. He walked outside. He walked to the fence at the edge of the compound as far from the barracks as he could go while remaining inside the authorized area. He stood there looking at Lake Erie. Emil found him 2 hours later. It was dark by then, cold March in Ohio. Matthias was still standing at the fence. Matthias. Matthias did not turn around. They're dead. All of them. I know. Morrison told me. I'm sorry. Dresden is gone. The whole city. 25,000 people. I know. Everything I had is gone. Everyone I had is gone. Emil did not say anything. What could he say? His own family in Hamburg had survived so far, but he knew that could change. Every prisoner at Camp Perry knew that. They were all waiting for notifications like the one Matthias had just received. After a long silence, Emil said the only thing that made any sense. Come inside. It's cold. Matthias did not come inside. He stood at that fence until the guards made him return to the barracks at lights out. After that night, Matthias stopped writing letters. There was nobody to write to. He stopped attending Sunday Mass. Father O'Brien tried to talk to him about this, offered spiritual counseling, but Matthias declined. He could not pray to a God who allowed Dresden to burn with his family inside. He worked on the Patterson farm during the day and sat alone in the barracks at night. Emil tried to reach him. Other prisoners tried to talk to him. Matthias would not respond. He was not rude. He simply had nothing to say. Many prisoners at Camp Perry had received similar notifications. By spring 1945, most had lost someone. Family members killed in bombing raids in combat in the general chaos of Germany's collapse. The prisoners knew Germany was losing the war. They could see it in the newsreels shown during movie night. They could hear it in the guards' conversations. They could feel it in the camp administration's increasingly relaxed security measures. By April 1945, guards no longer carried rifles when escorting work details. The prisoners were not considered escape risks. Where would they escape to? They had no money, no contacts, no way to return to Germany. And increasingly, many of them did not want to return. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Camp Perry administration announced this during morning formation. Some prisoners cried. Others stood silent, faces blank. Matthias felt nothing. The war ending meant he would be sent back to Germany, back to Dresden, back to rubble and ash and mass graves. He had no home to return to, no family waiting, no job, no possessions. Everything he had owned before the war was gone. Everything he had built in Ohio over 2 years, the routine, the work, the small comforts would also disappear. He would be shipped back to devastation. The thought made him physically sick. That night, May 8, 1945, while American soldiers at Camp Perry celebrated Victory in Europe Day with champagne and fireworks and songs. Matthias sat on his bunk in Barracks 7 and told Emil something that had been growing in his mind for months. "I want to stay in America." Emil looked at him. "What?" "I want to stay here. I don't want to go back to Germany." "Matthias, we don't have a choice. They're shipping us back. International law requires it." "I know, but I don't want to go." Emil sat down on the bunk across from Matthias. He leaned forward. "I understand. I feel the same way. My family is alive, but Hamburg is destroyed. My father's factory is rubble. There are no jobs, no food. Germany is finished. We've seen what America looks like. We've lived here. We've eaten here. We've worked here." "I know." "Then you understand." "Yes. But understanding doesn't change the law. We're enemy aliens. They have to send us back." "What if there's a way?" "What way?" Matthias did not have an answer. Not yet. But the question had been planted. The official policy was clear. All prisoners of war would be repatriated as quickly as possible after hostilities ended. The United States had signed international agreements requiring this. The process would begin immediately. Camp Perry administration posted notices explaining the timeline. Prisoners would be processed in groups transported to East Coast ports, loaded onto ships returned to Germany. The entire operation would take approximately 6 months. Matthias's group was scheduled for repatriation in October 1945. He had 5 months. 5 months to figure out how to stay, or 5 months to prepare for return to nothing. He chose to try staying. The methods available were limited. United States immigration law in 1945 explicitly prohibited former enemy soldiers from remaining in the country. No exceptions, no appeals. But Matthias had heard stories from other prisoners. Men who talked about POWs who had married American women, who had been sponsored by farmers who needed their labor, who had found legal loopholes. These stories were mostly rumors, but Matthias investigated anyway. Howard Patterson had become more than just an employer over the past 2 years. He had become something close to a friend within the constraints of their situation. They talked during work breaks. They discussed farming techniques. They shared observations about weather and soil and crop yields. Patterson knew Matthias's family had died in Dresden. Matthias had told him in late March 1945, 2 weeks after receiving the Red Cross notification. Patterson had been quiet for a long time after hearing this. Then he had said something Matthias would never forget. "I'm sorry, son. Nobody deserves that. Nobody." Patterson also knew Matthias was a skilled worker, reliable, hard-working, honest. Exactly the kind of person Patterson would want to employ permanently if such a thing were possible. In August 1945, 3 months before his scheduled repatriation, Matthias asked Patterson if there was any way to stay in America. They were standing in the barn taking shelter from a thunderstorm, watching rain hammer the fields. Patterson was quiet for a long time. Then he sighed. "I looked into it, Matthias. After you told me about Dresden, I asked some people, lawyers, immigration officers, anyone who might know. And there's no legal pathway for POWs to remain. Federal law prohibits it. No exceptions that I'm aware of. When the war ends, you go home. That's the rule." Matthias nodded. He had expected this answer, but he had needed to ask. Patterson was quiet for another moment. Then he made a decision. "But I'll tell you what. If you ever come back to America legally through normal immigration channels, whatever those might be, I will sponsor you. I'll provide employment, housing. I'll help with paperwork. I'll do whatever I can." He walked to his office in the farmhouse and returned with a piece of paper and a pen. He sat down and wrote for 10 minutes. When he finished, he folded the paper and handed it to Matthias. "This is a letter stating that I will employ you if you return to America as a legal immigrant. It's signed and dated. Keep it. I don't know if it'll ever be useful, but keep it." Matthias took the letter. His hands were shaking. "Why are you doing this?" Patterson looked at him. "Because you fixed that irrigation pipe without being asked. Because you work harder than most Americans I've employed. Because my boys are coming home from the Pacific and yours never will, and that's not fair. Because..." It's the right thing to do. Matthias held the letter like it was the most valuable thing he had ever touched, which it was. Thank you, Mr. Patterson. I will keep this, and I will find a way back. Patterson nodded. I hope you do, son. I truly hope you do. But hope was not a plan. Matthias had Patterson's letter, but he had no clear path to using it. Immigration law was immigration law. The United States was not accepting German immigrants in 1945, especially not former Wehrmacht soldiers. Still, Matthias folded the letter carefully and kept it in his pocket. Every day. He never let it out of his sight. As summer turned to fall, the camp administration accelerated repatriation preparations. More notices were posted, more schedules announced. The mood in the camp shifted. Some prisoners were eager to go home despite the destruction. They had families who had survived, homes that might still be standing. Reasons to hope. Matthias had none of that. He was returning to Dresden because international law required it, not because he wanted to. But before repatriation could proceed smoothly, there was one more complication. Oberfeldwebel Karl Zimmermann. Zimmermann was 38 years old from Munich, a former SS officer who had successfully hidden his SS affiliation when captured. On paper, he was regular Wehrmacht. In reality, he had served in SS units and maintained Nazi ideology with the fervor of a true believer. Zimmermann had been at Camp Perry since early 1943, arriving a few weeks before Matthias. He had established himself as a senior prisoner, a barracks leader, someone who enforced discipline among German POWs. The American administrators tolerated this because it made their jobs easier. Let the Germans manage themselves as long as no rules were broken. But Zimmermann had noticed Matthias. He had noticed Matthias attending English classes. He had noticed Matthias working enthusiastically at the Patterson farm. He had noticed Matthias becoming friendly with American guards. And Zimmermann did not approve. In December 1943, 9 months after both men arrived at Camp Perry, Zimmermann confronted Matthias in the barracks after dinner. Keller. Matthias looked up from the book he was reading. Yes, you're forgetting something. What am I forgetting? That you're German, that these people are the enemy, that we are prisoners of war, not guests at a resort. Matthias closed his book. I'm aware of my situation. Are you? Because from where I stand, you look like a collaborator, learning their language, working eagerly for their farmers, smiling at their guards. You're acting like a traitor. I'm following camp rules, working as required by Geneva Convention. Nothing more. You're doing more than that. You're enjoying this. You prefer this to serving the Reich. Matthias stood up. They were the same height, but Zimmermann was older, heavier, more intimidating. The Reich sent me to North Africa with no supplies, no support, and no chance of success. I nearly starved. Here they feed me. They treat me according to international law. They pay me for my work. Yes, I prefer this. Zimmermann's face darkened. When we return to Germany, there will be consequences for people like you, people who forgot their duty, people who betrayed their country. I didn't betray anything. I was captured. I'm surviving captivity, that's all. No, you're thriving. You're happy here. That makes you a traitor. Zimmermann walked away. But this was not the end. Over the next 18 months, Zimmermann spread rumors about Matthias, told other prisoners that Matthias was a communist sympathizer, an American collaborator, someone who could not be trusted. Most prisoners ignored this, but some believed it. Matthias found himself increasingly isolated within the German POW community. Men who had been friendly became distant. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Only Emil remained loyal. Don't listen to Zimmermann. He's a fanatic. When this war ends and everyone sees what the Nazis really did, he'll be the one with consequences, not you. But isolation still hurt. Matthias worked harder at the Patterson farm, spent more time alone, read more books, attended more English classes. If the other prisoners did not want his company, fine. He would focus on survival and planning. In August 1945, just before Matthias asked Patterson about staying in America, Zimmerman made one final attempt to cause trouble. He told Sergeant Morrison that Matthias had refused a work order that he was agitating among other prisoners, that he was a communist sympathizer who might cause problems during repatriation. Morrison investigated. He interviewed other prisoners. He talked to Corporal Davies, who supervised the Patterson farm work detail. He talked to Howard Patterson directly. Patterson was unequivocal. "That's a goddamn lie. Matthias Keller is the best worker I have ever employed, German or American. He's never refused an order. He's never caused trouble. He shows up on time, works hard, and goes above and beyond what's required. Whoever told you otherwise is lying." Morrison believed Patterson. He had no reason not to. Patterson was a respected member of the community, a farmer who employed American workers before the war and would employ them again after. If Patterson said Zimmerman was lying, then Zimmerman was lying. Morrison transferred Zimmerman to a different barracks. Officially, this was for administrative reasons. Unofficially, it was to separate him from Matthias and prevent further incidents. Before leaving, Zimmerman found Matthias one last time. "This isn't over, Keller. We're all going back to Germany soon. I'll see you there, and there will be consequences." Matthias said nothing. He watched Zimmerman walk away. He felt nothing. By August 1945, Matthias had already decided he would find a way to avoid returning to Germany. Zimmerman's threats were irrelevant. On October 3, 1945, Matthias Keller and 487 other German prisoners of war boarded trucks at Camp Perry for transport to Camp Shanks, New York. From there, they would board ships to Europe. The journey to Camp Shanks took 2 days. The trucks drove through Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York. The prisoners traveled through landscapes that reminded Matthias of Germany before the war. Small towns, farms, rolling hills, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Matthias watched America pass by through the truck window and tried to memorize it. He had no camera, no way to capture what he was seeing. He wanted to remember this country where he had been treated well, where he had gained 19 kilograms instead of losing them, where farmers spoke to him like a human being instead of a number. He kept Patterson's letter in his inside pocket, folded carefully, protected from damage. That letter was his only connection to a possible future. He guarded it like it was made of gold, because to him it was. Camp Shanks was different from Camp Perry. It was not a long-term prisoner of war facility. It was a processing center, a way station, a place where men waited to be shipped somewhere else. The barracks were temporary structures, overcrowded, designed for short stays. The food was adequate but not generous. The atmosphere was tense. Thousands of German prisoners of war were concentrated at Camp Shanks in October 1945, all waiting for ships. Some had been prisoners for 4 years. Others, like Matthias, had been captured more recently. They all faced the same uncertainty. What would Germany look like? What would they find there? What would be left? The men who had families they knew were alive talked about reunion. They talked about rebuilding. They made plans. The men who had received Red Cross notifications like Matthias had received sat quietly and said nothing. Emil was in the same group scheduled for the same ship. He sat next to Matthias in the barracks on the night of October 16, 1945, the night before their ship was scheduled to depart. "You still have Patterson's letter?" Matthias touched his inside pocket. "Yes." "You really think there's a way back?" "I don't know, but if there is, I'll find it." "If you do, tell me. I'll do the same. Hamburg is destroyed. My father's factory is gone. There's nothing for me there except my family, and even they're talking about leaving if they can." Where would they go? Anywhere. Britain, France, here if possible. They've seen what war does. They don't want to rebuild in the same place. The ship departed on October 17, 1945. The SS Marine Raven, a transport vessel carrying 3,200 German prisoners of war back to Europe. The crossing took 9 days. Matthias spent most of the voyage on deck, when weather permitted, watching the Atlantic, thinking about what came next. Other prisoners played cards in the holds, sang songs, argued about politics. Some of them were eager to return home despite the destruction. They had families who survived. Homes that might still be standing, or at least locations where homes had stood and could be rebuilt. They had reasons to hope. Matthias had none of that. He was returning to Dresden because international law required it, because the United States government had signed treaties obligating them to repatriate prisoners of war, because there was no legal alternative. But he was not returning because he wanted to. The ship docked at Cherbourg, France on October 26, 1945. From there, the prisoners were transported by train through France into the American occupation zone of Germany. The train moved slowly through the French countryside, then across the border. Matthias saw the destruction through the train windows. Cities reduced to rubble, bridges destroyed, factories bombed into skeletal frameworks of twisted steel. The scale was difficult to comprehend. Every major town showed damage. Every city they passed through had been hit by Allied bombing. France had been occupied and then liberated. The destruction was significant, but not total. But when the train crossed into Germany, the devastation intensified. Every bridge replacement was temporary. Every train station was damaged. Every major city visible from the tracks was a landscape of ruins. By the time the train reached Bavaria, Matthias understood what he was returning to. The Americans processed the returning prisoners of war at a displaced persons camp near Mannheim. Medical examinations, documentation, assignment to temporary housing, distribution of basic supplies. Matthias was given papers identifying him as a former Wehrmacht soldier discharged residing temporarily in the American occupation zone. He was free to travel within the occupation zones. He was free to find work. He was free to rebuild his life. He had no money except 50 Reichsmarks provided by the American authorities. The Reichsmark had collapsed. 50 Reichsmarks would buy almost nothing. He had no possessions except the clothes the Americans had given him at Camp Perry, worn now, but still better than what most German civilians were wearing. He had no contacts except other former prisoners. He asked the camp administrators about Dresden. They told him Dresden was in the Soviet occupation zone. Travel there would be difficult but possible. Papers would need to be obtained. Soviet checkpoints would need to be navigated. It would take time. Matthias decided to try. He wanted to see what remained. He needed to confirm what he already knew. On November 2, 1945, he boarded a train heading east toward the Soviet zone. The journey took 3 days. The train moved slowly, stopping frequently at checkpoints where Soviet soldiers inspected passengers and documents. Matthias's papers were in order. He was allowed to continue. Dresden appeared through the train window on the afternoon of November 5, 1945. The city Matthias remembered, the city of Baroque architecture and cultural heritage, the Florence of the North, no longer existed. What remained was skeletal. The Frauenkirche, the iconic church that had dominated Dresden's skyline for 200 years, was a pile of blackened stone. The dome had collapsed. The walls had crumbled. What stood was barely recognizable as a building. The residential neighborhoods where Matthias had grown up were flattened, block after block of rubble, burned-out building frames, collapsed walls, streets filled with debris that had been partially cleared to allow vehicle passage, but only partially. The train station itself was damaged but functional. Matthias stepped off the train and walked into the city he had left in 1941. He walked for 6 hours. He walked through streets that should have been familiar and recognized nothing. The street names were still posted on signs that had survived, but the buildings that had defined those streets were gone. He navigated by memory and by asking the few people he saw, thin, exhausted-looking civilians, picking through rubble, searching for anything salvageable. He found the block where his family's apartment building had stood. The entire block was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed. Gone. Only foundations remained, and those were filled with debris that had been partially cleared but not removed. There were markers indicating mass graves nearby. Thousands of people buried in places that had once been parks or public squares. Matthias stood where his childhood home had been and tried to process what he was seeing. The building where he had lived for 18 years, where his mother had cooked meals, where his father had read newspapers, where his sister had done her schooling, where the family had gathered for dinners and holidays and ordinary evenings. All of it was gone. reduced to rubble and ash and memory. He could not process this emotionally. The scale of destruction exceeded his capacity to feel it. He stood there for perhaps 20 minutes, trying to make himself understand what had happened here. He failed. He turned around and walked back toward the train station. He stayed in Dresden for 6 hours total, then he left. He never returned. By December 1945, Matthias was living in Mannheim, working as a day laborer at reconstruction sites. The work was brutal, clearing rubble, salvaging bricks that could be reused, hauling debris to collection points, loading trucks, unloading trucks, manual labor in winter cold. He was paid in Reichsmarks that had minimal value. The German economy had collapsed. Currency was nearly worthless. Food was obtained through rations provided by occupation authorities, and those rations were insufficient. The official ration in the American zone in winter 1945 was approximately 1,550 calories per day for normal workers. In practice, it was often less. Matthias lost weight. By January 1946, he weighed 63 kilograms. He had lost 12 kilograms since leaving Camp Perry 3 months earlier. He was not starving, not yet, but he was hungry constantly. His body, which had recovered from malnutrition during 2 years of American captivity, was declining again. He thought about Ohio constantly, about the farm, about Patterson's letter which he still kept in his inside pocket, protected from the weather and the work and the chaos, about breakfast at Camp Perry, eggs and bacon and real coffee, about Thanksgiving turkey, about beds with mattresses, about electric lights that worked reliably. He had traded all of that for this, for freedom, for the right to stand in the ruins of his destroyed city and clear rubble for worthless currency. Every night before sleeping he read Patterson's letter. The paper was becoming worn from handling creased and soft. The ink was still legible. The words still promised something. If you ever return to America legally, I will sponsor you. But how United States immigration law in 1946 prohibited entry for former enemy soldiers. There was no legal pathway, no process to apply for. Matthias asked other former prisoners who were also living in Mannheim, working the same brutal labor jobs, surviving on the same insufficient rations. Everyone had heard rumors. Someone knew someone whose cousin had married an American woman and gotten a visa. Someone else had heard about farmers sponsoring workers. But these were always third-hand stories. Nobody had actual documentation. Nobody knew the process. In February 1946, while working a rubble-clearing site, Matthias found a photograph in the debris. It was damaged by water and fire, but partially intact. A family portrait. Parents and 3 children posed formally in a photographer's studio. The photograph was from the 1930s, judging by the clothing and style. Matthias did not know this family, but he kept the photograph. He put it in his pocket next to Patterson's letter. He carried both items every day. He could not explain why he kept the photograph. Perhaps because it was evidence that families had existed here, that ordinary people had lived ordinary lives before the war destroyed everything, that what had been lost was real and specific and valuable. In March 1946, Matthias sold his Camp Perry coat, the coat the Americans had given him, the warm, well-made coat that had kept him comfortable through 2 Ohio winters. He sold it on the black market for food, a loaf of bread, some potatoes, a small amount of margarine. He regretted this immediately. The coat was worth more than the food, but he was hungry, and hunger makes people make decisions they later regret. After selling the coat, Matthias was cold constantly. He found a thin jacket that barely helped. He endured. Emil wrote from Hamburg. Letters arrived irregularly, but they arrived. Emil was working at the docks, loading and unloading ships. The work was hard, but the pay was slightly better than inland labor because Hamburg was a port and ports had access to goods. Emil was saving money. Not much because there was nothing to save, but he was trying. I haven't forgotten what you said about returning to America, Emil wrote in April 1946. I think about it constantly. If there's a way, we'll find it. In 1947, Matthias heard rumors that the United States was discussing immigration reform, that there might be provisions for refugees, for displaced persons. He tried to find official information but could not. The rumors persisted, but nothing concrete materialized. He kept working, clearing rubble, hauling debris, surviving. He kept reading Patterson's letter every night. He kept waiting. In January 1948, the United States Congress began debating the Displaced Persons Act. The proposed law would allow refugees from Europe to immigrate to America under specific conditions. The law was primarily intended for concentration camp survivors, for people displaced by the war who could not return to their home countries because of persecution or because those countries no longer existed in any meaningful form. But the proposed law included provisions for carefully screened former German soldiers who could demonstrate they were not war criminals and who had sponsors in America. Matthias heard about this in March 1948. He was working a construction site when another former prisoner mentioned it. Someone had seen a newspaper article. Someone else had heard a radio broadcast. The details were unclear, but the basic fact seemed true. There might be a way. Matthias went to the American Military Administration Office in Mannheim and asked for information. The clerk, a bored corporal who spoke minimal German, gave him a pamphlet. The pamphlet explained the Displaced Persons Act in general terms. It listed requirements. It provided an address where applications could be sent. Matthias read the pamphlet 17 times. He met the basic requirements. He was a refugee. He had no home to return to. He had been a Wehrmacht soldier, but only in logistics, no combat role, no war crimes. He had documentation from Camp Perry showing exemplary conduct. He had Patterson's letter offering employment and sponsorship. On paper, he qualified. In April 1948, Matthias submitted his application. He included Patterson's letter. He included his Camp Perry records, which he had requested and received from the American authorities. He included a statement explaining his situation: family, dead city, destroyed, no future in Germany, honest work awaiting him in America. He mailed the application to the address listed in the pamphlet and waited. 3 weeks later, he received a response, an appointment for an interview with an immigration officer. The interview would be conducted in Frankfurt at the American consulate. Matthias traveled to Frankfurt on May 14, 1948. The journey took most of a day. He wore the best clothes he could assemble, not good clothes, but clean and presentable. The immigration officer was named Walter Brennan, Irish-American, 45 years old, from Boston. His family had immigrated in the 1890s. He had kind eyes, but a professional demeanor that suggested he took his work seriously. Brennan reviewed Matthias's file for several minutes before speaking. "Mr. Keller, why do you want to immigrate to America?" Matthias had prepared for this question. "Because Germany is destroyed. Because my family is dead. Because I have no future here. Because America treated me with dignity when I was a prisoner, and I believe I can build a life there." "You were Wehrmacht. You fought for the Nazi regime." "I was drafted at 18. I served in logistics, not combat." "I never killed anyone." "I was captured in Tunisia and held as a prisoner of war for 2 years. I followed all rules. I have documentation confirming this." Brennan looked at the Camp Perry records. "Your conduct as a prisoner was exemplary. The American officers who supervised you gave you strong recommendations. That's unusual." "I worked hard. I followed regulations. I tried to survive captivity with dignity." "Your sponsor is a farmer named Howard Patterson." "Yes, sir. I worked on his farm while I was a prisoner. He offered to employ me if I returned to America legally." Brennan read Patterson's letter carefully. "This letter is 2.5 years old. How do you know Mr. Patterson still wants to employ you?" "I don't know, but he gave me his word. I believe him." Brennan made notes in the file. "I need to verify this. I'll contact Mr. Patterson directly. If he confirms his offer, we'll schedule a second interview. This process takes time, Mr. Keller. Months, possibly more than a year. Be patient." Matthias nodded. He left the consulate with hope. Real hope for the first time since the war ended. The second interview came in July 1948. Brennan had contacted Patterson. Patterson had confirmed everything. The job offer was still valid. The sponsorship was still offered. Patterson had written a new letter, recent and specific, stating his intention to employ Matthias Keller as a farm worker at $35 per week, plus housing. The second interview focused on Matthias's political beliefs. Had he been a Nazi Party member? No. Had he believed in Nazi ideology? Matthias answered honestly. He had believed some of the propaganda when he was younger because everyone believed it. But 2 years in an American POW camp, being treated according to Geneva Convention, while hearing about concentration camps and seeing his own city destroyed by his own government's decisions, had changed his mind. If another war comes, which side would you fight for? Matthias had prepared for this question too. I will never hold a weapon again, sir, but if I was forced to choose, I would defend the country that gave me a second chance. Brennan studied him. America defeated Germany, bombed your cities, killed your people, and you'd defend America. America didn't start the war, sir. Germany did. America treated me humanely when I was captured. Germany destroyed my family and my city. The choice is clear. The third interview came in December 1948. This one was shorter. Brennan reviewed the background checks that had been conducted. No war crimes, no Nazi Party affiliation, no criminal record. Clean. He reviewed Matthias's work history in Germany since repatriation. Day labor construction, rubble clearing. Honest work. He reviewed Patterson's most recent letter, which had arrived that week. Patterson was asking when Matthias might arrive because the 1949 growing season would begin in spring and he needed reliable workers. Brennan closed the file. Mr. Keller, your application has been approved. You'll receive your immigration visa within 3 months. Congratulations. Matthias sat very still. He held the letter with both hands to steady it. He did not trust himself to speak. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Thank Mr. Patterson. And don't make me regret this decision. You're getting a chance most people don't get. Use it well. I will, sir. I promise. The approval letter arrived on September 12, 1949, 4 years and 11 months after Matthias had left Camp Perry as a repatriated prisoner of war. The letter included a visa travel instructions and a date. He was to report to Bremerhaven on October 1st to board a ship to New York. Matthias held the letter and cried. He had not cried when his family died. He had not cried when he saw Dresden destroyed. But he cried holding this letter. Emil came to Mannheim when he heard. His own application was still pending, but he was happy for Matthias. You did it. You actually did it. Patterson did it. He kept his word. When you get there, write to me. Tell me everything. I'll follow as soon as I can. I will. I promise. They embraced. 2 men who had survived Tunisia and captivity and repatriation and devastation. 2 men who had chosen hope over despair. On October 1st, 1949, Matthias reported to Bremerhaven. He boarded a ship to New York. He traveled as an immigrant this time, not a prisoner. He had legal papers. He had a sponsor. He had a future. He stood on the deck as the ship pulled away from Germany and looked back at the coastline. 4 years earlier, he had stood on a different ship traveling in the opposite direction, being forced back to a country that no longer existed in any meaningful form. Now he was returning to the country that had held him prisoner and treated him like a human being. The crossing took 8 days. On October 12, 1949, the ship docked in New York Harbor. Matthias walked down the gangway carrying everything he owned in a small bag. He had almost nothing. But he had Patterson's letter worn and creased from 4 years of handling. He had his visa. He had his documentation. And waiting for him at the dock, leaning against a truck, was Howard Patterson. Patterson was 58 years old now. His hair was grayer, his face more weathered. But he was smiling. They shook hands. Patterson's grip was strong. Welcome back, Matthias. Or should I say, welcome home. Matthias could not speak. His voice failed him. He nodded. Patterson understood. He clapped Matthias on the shoulder. Come on, let's go to Ohio. We've got work to do. They drove west through New York, through Pennsylvania, through Ohio. Matthias watched the American countryside pass by the truck window. He had memorized this landscape 4 years earlier, trying to hold on to it. Now he was seeing it again as a free man. Patterson talked during the drive. About the farm. About the growing seasons Matthias had missed. About changes in the area. About his sons. Nathaniel had recovered from his wounds, and was teaching high school history in Cleveland. Samuel had come home from the Pacific and was working as a civil engineer in Columbus. They both want to meet you. I told them about you, about the work you did, about how you came back. They don't mind that I was German. Patterson glanced at him. They fought Germans and Japanese. They saw terrible things, but they also learned that people are people. The uniform doesn't define the man. They'll judge you by your work and your character, same as I do. They arrived at the farm late in the afternoon. The same white farmhouse, the same red barn, the same fields Matthias had worked 4 years earlier. But everything was different because Matthias was different. He was not a prisoner anymore. He was an employee, an immigrant, a man with legal status and a future. Patterson showed him to a small house on the farm property, a worker's cottage, 2 rooms, a kitchen, a bathroom, simple furniture, but it was clean and warm, and it was his. This is yours, $35 a week, plus room and board. You'll work the same hours as before, but you're free to come and go as you please. You're not a prisoner. You're my employee. Understood? Matthias stood in the doorway of his house, the first place he had lived that was his own since leaving Dresden 8 years earlier. Understood. Thank you, Mr. Patterson. Howard. You can call me Howard now. Thank you, Howard. That night, Matthias slept in a real bed in his own house on an American farm. He had travelled 34 days to reach Camp Perry as a prisoner in 1943. He had travelled 4 years and 8 days to return as a free man in 1949. He kept Patterson's letter on the table next to his bed. He would keep it there for the rest of his life. Outside, the Ohio night was quiet. The tomato fields stretched toward the horizon. Lake Erie was 20 miles north. Somewhere beyond that lake, beyond the border, beyond the ocean, Germany was rebuilding from ruins. But Matthias Keller was home. The first morning Matthias woke up in his own house, he did not immediately remember where he was. For a moment he thought he was back in Barracks 7 at Camp Perry. Then he thought he was in the displaced persons shelter in Mannheim. Then he opened his eyes and saw sunlight coming through clean windows and remembered. Ohio, his own house, freedom. He got up at 5:30 dressed and walked to the farmhouse. Howard Patterson was already in the kitchen drinking coffee. His wife Margaret was making breakfast. "You're up early," Patterson said. "Old habits." "Sit down." Margaret made extra. Matthias sat at the kitchen table and ate breakfast with the Patterson family for the first time as a free man. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, the same breakfast he had eaten 1,000 times at Camp Perry. But this time nobody was counting prisoners. Nobody was enforcing regulations. He was eating as a guest, as an employee, as someone who belonged. Margaret Patterson was 56 years old, grey-haired, with the practical manner of someone who had run a farm household for decades. She set a plate in front of Matthias without ceremony. "Howard says you're a good worker." "I try to be, Ma'am. That's all anyone can ask. Eat. You'll need your strength." The work was the same work Matthias had done as a prisoner, tending tomato plants, managing irrigation, harvesting, loading trucks. But everything felt different because he was free to leave if he wanted. He could quit. He could walk away. The fact that he had no intention of doing either of those things did not matter. The choice existed. Patterson paid him $35 every Friday in cash. Real money, legal wages. Matthias saved almost everything. He had nowhere to spend it and nothing he needed to buy. The room and board Patterson provided covered all his basic needs. The money accumulated in a coffee can Matthias kept under his bed. In November 1949, 1 month after arriving in Ohio, Matthias walked into Port Clinton for the first time as a free man. The town was small, maybe 7,000 people built around the Lake Erie waterfront. Main Street had shops and a diner and a church and a post office. Some of the locals recognized him. They had seen him during the war riding in trucks with other prisoners working on farms around the area. Some of them stared. Some of them looked away. A few nodded in greeting. Matthias bought stamps at the post office and mailed a letter to Emil in Hamburg. 5 pages describing everything. The journey back. Patterson waiting at the dock. The house. The work. The future. "I made it," he wrote. "If I can do this, you can too. Don't give up." He mailed a second letter to Walter Brennan at the immigration office in Cleveland, thanking him for approving the visa. Brennan had taken a chance on a former enemy soldier. Matthias wanted him to know it was not a mistake. In December, Matthias attended Sunday Mass at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Port Clinton. The church was small, built in the 1880s with stained glass windows and wooden pews that creaked when people sat down. The congregation was maybe 150 people. The priest was Father Michael O'Brien, the same Father O'Brien who had been chaplain at Camp Perry during the war. He was 49 years old now, assigned to St. Mary's Parish after his military service ended. O'Brien recognized Matthias immediately. After the Mass he approached. "Matthias Keller, I heard you came back." "Yes, Father." "Legally this time." "Yes, Father." O'Brien smiled. "I'm glad. You're home now." "Thank you, Father. I remember you from the camp. You stopped coming to Mass after Dresden." "Yes. Will you come now?" Matthias thought about this. "I don't know. I'm still angry at God." "That's honest. God can handle your anger. Come anyway." Matthias did. He attended Mass every Sunday, sitting in the back pew, listening to Father O'Brien's sermons about forgiveness and redemption and the possibility of peace. He did not take communion. He was not ready for that. But he came. The Port Clinton community gradually accepted him. The process was slow. Some people would never accept a former German soldier living among them. Their sons had died fighting Germany. Their brothers, their husbands. The wounds were too fresh. But others judged Matthias by his present actions rather than his past allegiance. He showed up for work every day. He helped neighbors when they needed extra hands. He kept to himself and caused no trouble. Over time, the suspicion faded. In March 1950, Emil's letter arrived. His immigration application had been approved. He would arrive in New York in May. He had found a sponsor, a steel mill in Cleveland, that needed workers and was willing to hire former POWs who had clean records. Matthias read the letter 3 times. Emil had made it. They had both made it. In May 1950, Matthias took a day off work and rode with Patterson to Cleveland to meet Emil at the train station. Emil stepped off the train looking thinner than Matthias remembered, but smiling. They embraced. 2 men who had survived everything. 2 men who had refused to accept devastation as their permanent condition. "You look good," Emil said. "America agrees with you." "It does, you'll see." They had dinner in Cleveland that night. Matthias and Emil and Patterson's son Samuel, who was finishing his engineering degree at Ohio State and happened to be in Cleveland that weekend. 4 men sitting in a diner eating hamburgers and talking about the future. Samuel Patterson was 27 years old. He had spent 3 years in the Pacific seen combat at Iwo Jima. Come home with scars he did not talk about. He shook Emil's hand without hesitation. "My father says you and Matthias were good workers. We tried to be. That's all that matters. The war's over. We all have to live in the world that comes after." On June 4, 1952, Matthias attended a church social at St. Mary's. These events happened once a month, usually on Saturday afternoons. Food conversation, community building. Matthias had been attending for 6 months, mostly standing in corners, not talking much. That day, Father O'Brien introduced him to Anna Fischer. Anna was 26 years old from a small town outside Munich. She had arrived in America in 1948 through the Displaced Persons Act, sponsored by a family in Port Clinton who needed a seamstress. She was quiet, competent, still adjusting to American life. Father O'Brien made the introduction because he thought they might have things in common. Both German, both immigrants, both rebuilding lives far from home. "Anna, this is Matthias Keller. He works for Howard Patterson. Matthias, this is Anna Fischer. She does alterations at the dress shop on Main Street." They shook hands. Anna's grip was firm. "Pleased to meet you," she said in English. "Likewise," Matthias replied. They stood there awkwardly for a moment. Then Anna switched to German. How long have you been in America? 3 years. You? 4 years. I came in 1948. Through the DP Act. Yes. You too. Yes. They talked for 20 minutes. Careful conversation, both of them still learning how to interact with people after years of disruption and displacement. But the conversation was easy because they understood each other's context. They had both left destroyed cities. They had both chosen to rebuild elsewhere. Before the social ended, Matthias asked if he could walk her home. Anna agreed. They walked through Port Clinton as the sun set, talking in German about things they could not easily discuss in English, about what they had left behind, about what they were building, about the strange feeling of being permanent foreigners in a country that had given them chances their homeland could not. "Do you ever think about going back?" Anna asked. "No, never. You?" "Sometimes, but only to visit, not to stay. There's nothing there for me now." "Same." They reached Anna's boarding house. Matthias asked if he could see her again. Anna said yes. They courted for 11 months. Walks after church, dinners in Port Clinton, long conversations in German that neither of them could have in English. Anna learned about Matthias's time as a prisoner, his family's death in Dresden, his decision to return to America. Matthias learned about Anna's experience fleeing Bavaria as the war ended, losing her brother to the final desperate battles, immigrating alone at age 22. They understood each other in ways that Americans could not understand. They had both survived the unsurvivable and chosen to build futures rather than dwell on loss. On June 13, 1953, they married at St. Mary's Church. Father O'Brien performed the ceremony. Howard and Margaret Patterson attended along with Samuel Patterson and his new wife. Emil came from Cleveland with his girlfriend. About 40 people, total a mix of German immigrants and Americans from the Port Clinton community. At the reception held in the church basement, Howard Patterson gave a toast. "I met Matthias 10 years ago when he was a prisoner of war working on my farm. I'll be honest, I didn't want German prisoners working for me. My boys were fighting Germans. It felt wrong. But Matthias changed my mind. He worked harder than anyone I'd ever employed. He was honest and skilled and decent. When the war ended, I told him if he ever came back to America legally, I'd help him. I'm proud he took me up on that. I'm proud to be here today. Congratulations to both of you." Matthias stood and responded, speaking in accented but clear English. "Thank you, Howard. You saved my life, not by giving me work, by giving me hope when I had nothing. I will never forget that." The newlyweds moved into the workers' cottage on Patterson's farm. It was small, but it was theirs. Anna continued working as a seamstress. Matthias continued farming. They saved money together, planning for a future that was beginning to feel real. On September 17, 1955, Matthias became a United States citizen. The ceremony was held at the federal courthouse in Cleveland. 83 immigrants from 19 countries took the oath of citizenship that day. Walter Brennan attended the ceremony. He had transferred to the Cleveland Immigration Office in 1953 and made a point of attending citizenship ceremonies for people he had personally approved. He found Matthias afterward. "Congratulations, Mr. Keller. You've earned this." "Thank you, Mr. Brennan, for everything, for taking a chance on me. You proved me right. That's all I needed." They shook hands. Brennan moved on to congratulate other new citizens. Matthias stood holding his citizenship certificate. He gripped it carefully, afraid he might drop it. That night, Anna asked him what he was feeling. "Strange. I renounced Germany in my mind in 1945 when I saw Dresden destroyed. But today it became official. I'm American now. Do you regret it?" "No. Germany is my past. America is my future. I made the right choice." In November 1956, Matthias voted in his first American election. Eisenhower versus Stevenson, a rematch of 1952. Matthias voted for Eisenhower. He took his son Garrett, who was 2 years old, to the polling station. "In Germany, I couldn't vote Garrett. The government made decisions and people followed. Here we choose. This is what freedom looks like. Remember this when you're older." Garrett was too young to understand. But Matthias wanted to mark the moment anyway. That same month, Matthias bought his own farm. 40 acres south of Port Clinton, with a small farmhouse that needed work, a barn in decent condition, and soil that could grow anything with proper care. The price was $8,400. Matthias had saved $3,000 over 7 years. Howard Patterson co-signed a bank loan for the remaining $5,400. But before the purchase could be finalized, there was a public hearing. In April 1956, the Port Clinton Town Council held a meeting about zoning changes that would affect farmland south of town. Matthias attended because he was considering buying property in that area. During the hearing, a man stood up. Lawrence Mitchell, 52 years old, local businessman. He had lost a son at Normandy. "I have a question about who's buying farmland around here. I heard a German is looking to purchase the Morrison property." The room went quiet. "That's right," Mitchell continued. "A former Wehrmacht soldier, a prisoner of war, and now he wants to own American land." Matthias sat very still. Howard Patterson stood up. "Larry Matthias Keller has been working for me for 7 years. He's a citizen, he votes, he pays taxes, he's earned the right to own property same as anyone. Your boys came home, Howard. Mine didn't. And you want me to accept that a German soldier gets to live here, buy land here, build a life here?" The silence was painful. Matthias stood. He had not planned to speak, but he spoke. "Mr. Mitchell, you're right. Your son died fighting Germany." "My family died because of Germany. We both lost people to the same war. I can't change that. I can only tell you that I work hard, I follow the law, and I try to be a good neighbor. If that's not enough, I understand, but I'm not leaving." Mitchell looked at him for a long time. Then he sat down. He said nothing else. The zoning changes passed. 3 weeks later, Matthias bought the Morrison property, 40 acres. Mitchell never spoke to Matthias, but he never tried to stop him either. The bank officer asked Patterson one more time, "You're sure about this? You're guaranteeing a loan for a German immigrant?" "I'm guaranteeing a loan for the best worker I've ever had. His being German is irrelevant." The loan was approved. Matthias and Anna moved into their own farmhouse in December 1956. For the first time since leaving Dresden 15 years earlier, Matthias owned property. Land, a house, something permanent. Anna was pregnant with their second child. Their daughter Lorelei would be born in February 1957. Their third child, a son they would name Nathaniel after Patterson's oldest son, would be born in July 1959. Matthias farmed his 40 acres with the same dedication he had brought to Patterson's farm. He grew tomatoes, corn, soybeans. He worked dawn to dusk during growing season. He invested every dollar back into the farm. By 1960, he had paid off the bank loan. By 1963, he had expanded to 80 acres. In August 1963, Matthias received a letter from the West German government. The letter explained that citizens who had lost property during the war were eligible for compensation. Based on records from Dresden, the Keller family's apartment and possessions were valued at approximately 15,000 Deutschmarks. Matthias could claim this compensation by completing the attached forms. Anna found him that evening sitting at the kitchen table reading the letter. "What is it?" "The German government wants to pay me for what was lost in Dresden. That's significant money. 15,000 Deutschmarks is almost $4,000. Matthias read the letter again. Then he tore it in half, then in quarters. Then he threw the pieces into the kitchen trash. "Matthias, what are you doing? I don't want their money. I own 80 acres in Ohio, free and clear. I built this with my hands. Germany owes me nothing. I owe Germany nothing. That life is over." Anna did not argue. She understood. The farm continued to grow. By 1970, Matthias owned 120 acres. He employed seasonal workers during harvest, local teenagers, migrant workers, anyone who wanted honest work and honest pay. He treated all of them fairly the same way Patterson had treated him. He remembered what it felt like to be given a chance when you had nothing. He tried to give other people the same chance. On March 22, 1971, Howard Patterson died. He was 82 years old. Heart failure sudden at home. He had been working in his barn that morning. By afternoon, he was gone. The funeral was at St. Mary's Church. The building was packed. Patterson had been a respected member of the Port Clinton community for 6 decades. Farmers, business owners, family, friends. The church could barely hold everyone. Matthias sat in the third pew with Anna and their children. When Father O'Brien asked if anyone wanted to speak, Matthias stood and walked to the front. He had prepared nothing. He spoke from the heart. Howard Patterson saved my life. Not by giving me work, though he did that. Not by sponsoring my immigration, though he did that too. He saved my life by giving me hope when I had nothing. In August 1945, when I was about to be sent back to a destroyed Germany with no family and no future, Howard wrote me a letter. He promised that if I ever came back to America legally, he would help me. He kept that promise. I would not be standing here today if not for that letter. My children would not exist. My farm would not exist. Everything I have built started with Howard's decision to treat me like a human being when I was a prisoner. He didn't have to do that, but he did, and I will never forget it. Matthias sat down. The church was silent. After the funeral, Nathaniel Patterson Jr. and Samuel Patterson approached Matthias. Both men were in their 50s now. Our father talked about you often, Nathaniel said. He was proud of what you built. He said you proved that treating people with dignity changes lives. Your father changed mine. We know. Thank you for saying that. It would have meant a lot to him. In October 1975, Matthias received a letter from Munich. The return address was unfamiliar. He opened it carefully. The letter was from a woman named Ingrid Zimmermann. She was writing to inform him that her husband Karl Zimmermann had died in August 1975. Karl had left instructions that certain people from his past should be notified. Matthias was on that list. The letter continued. Karl had returned to Germany in 1945, bitter and angry. He had never forgiven anyone who he believed had betrayed Germany by cooperating with the Americans. He had spent 30 years working menial jobs, refusing promotions, refusing to adapt to post-war Germany. He had died alone, estranged from his children, angry at the world. Ingrid was writing because she wanted Matthias to know that Karl's anger had consumed him, that refusing to forgive or move forward had destroyed him. She did not know the details of what had happened between Karl and Matthias at Camp Perry, but she knew Karl had listed Matthias as someone who had chosen wrong. I believe my husband was the one who chose wrong, she wrote. I hope you found peace in your choices. Karl never did. Matthias showed the letter to Anna that evening. I chose forgiveness, he said. He chose anger. Look where we ended up. In July 1976, Emil Schneider came to visit. Emil was 59 years old now, recently retired from the Cleveland steel mill where he had worked for 26 years. He had married in 1952, had 4 children, bought a house in a Cleveland suburb. He had become a union representative and helped other immigrant workers navigate American life. Emil and Matthias sat on the porch of Matthias's farmhouse, looking out over 120 acres of productive land. They drank beer and spoke German, and remembered. You remember that night in May 1945, Emil asked, when you told me you wanted to stay in Ohio? I remember. Morrison laughed at me. He said you'd change your mind once you saw home. I saw home. It was rubble. I didn't change my mind. We proved him wrong, both of us. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the tomato fields. Do you ever regret it? Emil asked. Leaving Germany? Never. Not once. You? No. America gave me more than Germany ever could have in 1945. I made the right choice. We both did. On November 9th, 1989, Matthias sat in his living room with Anna and their grandchildren watching television as the Berlin Wall came down. He was 67 years old. The children ranged in age from 8 to 16. They were watching history happen, though they did not fully understand what it meant. Matthias cried as he watched Germans from east and west embrace each other as the wall that had divided his homeland for 28 years crumbled. His granddaughter, 10 years old, asked why he was crying.
Because Germany is finally free, sweetheart. After 44 years, Germany is free again. But Opa, aren't you American now? I am. I've been American for 34 years, but I was born German. Germany was my first home. I'm happy for the people there. Do you want to go back? Matthias thought about this. To visit, maybe, but not to stay. Ohio is my home now. It has been for 40 years. In March 1994, Matthias wrote a letter to his children and grandchildren. It was the 50th anniversary of his capture in Tunisia, March 17, 1943 to March 17, 1994. He felt compelled to document his story before memory faded. The letter was 8 pages handwritten, detailed. He described his capture, his arrival at Camp Perry, his time working for Patterson, the death of his family, his repatriation, his return. He explained why he had made the choices he made, why he had refused to accept devastation as permanent, why he had fought to come back to America. The letter ended with a passage he had thought about for years. I was born twice. Once in Dresden in 1922, once in Camp Perry, Ohio in 1943. The first birth gave me blood and homeland. The second gave me dignity and future. I was captured as an enemy on March 17, 1943. I was treated as a human being for 2 years. When I returned to America in 1949, I returned as a friend. Germany could not give me a future in 1945, only ash and hunger. America, the nation I had fought against, gave me everything: work, family, land, freedom. Remember this. How you treat people, even enemies, shapes who they become. Howard Patterson treated me like a man when I was a number. That is why you have a grandfather who is an American farmer, not a German beggar. Kindness is stronger than hate. I am living proof. He sealed the letter and put it in his desk drawer. He would give it to his children later when the time was right. On March 15, 1998, Matthias Keller died peacefully in his sleep. He was 76 years old. Anna had died 3 years earlier. He was buried next to her in the Port Clinton Cemetery. The funeral was held at St. Mary's Church. The building was full. 3 children, 7 grandchildren, friends, neighbors, members of the German-American community, people whose lives Matthias had touched in small and large ways over nearly 50 years. Garrett Keller. Matthias's oldest son stood at the pulpit with the letter his father had written in 1994. 8 pages handwritten, creased from being read many times. He did not read all of it. He read the passages his father had underlined. I was born twice. Garrett began, his voice steady. Once in Dresden in 1922. Once in Camp Perry, Ohio in 1943. He paused, looked up at the congregation. I was captured as an enemy on March 17, 1943. I was treated as a human being for 2 years. When I returned to America in 1949, I returned as a friend. Another pause. The church was silent. Howard Patterson treated me like a man when I was a number. That is why you have a grandfather who is an American farmer, not a German beggar. Kindness is stronger than hate. I am living proof. When Garrett folded the letter, people were crying. Emil Schneider, 81 years old in a wheelchair, spoke briefly. Matthias was braver than any of us. He chose hope over hate. He chose to build rather than destroy. He chose to forgive rather than nurse grievances. He made the hard choice. The right choice. And he proved that it was possible to transform from enemy to friend. I'm honored to have known him. After the funeral, Garrett and his son Fletcher drove to the farm. Fletcher was 16 years old, interested in farming, considering taking over the family land when he was older. They walked through the tomato fields. The same fields Matthias had worked as a prisoner in 1943. The same fields he had farmed as a free man from 1956 to 1998. Dad, was Grandpa really a prisoner here? Yes, during the war. He worked these fields as a POW. And they treated him well. They fed him so well he gained 19 kilograms. That's why he wanted to stay. That's weird. Garrett picked a tomato, ripe and heavy, and handed it to Fletcher. "No, son, it's not weird, it's proof. Proof that how you treat people, even enemies, matters more than you think. An American farmer treated a German prisoner like a human being. 55 years later, we're standing on the result. This farm exists because of that choice. Remember that." Fletcher held the tomato, thinking. Did it work? The kindness. "You're standing on the answer." They walked back toward the farmhouse as the sun set over Ohio. Matthias Keller's farmhouse, built on land he had purchased with money he had saved from honest work. 120 acres now passed from father to son. The fields Matthias had worked as prisoner number 4127 in 1943. The fields he had farmed as citizen Matthias Keller from 1956 to 1998. The fields Fletcher would farm after Garrett. 3 generations, 1 choice, 1 farmer who had treated a prisoner like a human being. The farm was his legacy, but the real legacy was simpler. He had been captured as an enemy and treated as a human being. When he returned as a friend, and that made all the difference.